Okay, welcome to the Wayne Maine Planning Board meeting. For tonight, first I will ask for a roll call. Starting from you, Jeannie.
Jeannie Burnett.
Doug Ferris,
Ed Bergman,
Tom Moran,
Andrew Goral. And Jeannie, tonight, I believe you'll be serving as we're not voting, but we're
Is Mitchell on?
well. If we did vote. I believe Mitchell was not. I told him
He's supposed to be on, but
well, I talked to him, he's on vacation. I told him if we didn't need a forum, he was off. So if we do any voting tonight, then you'll be a full voting member, if that's okay with you. Okay. The minutes from last meeting are not ready yet, so we will approve them.
they were loud.
Next month. There were a lot. So we'll move on to our first and only order of business tonight, which is hearing the presentation from the moratorium committee on the work they've been doing. So if you are ready to present, however you wish to.
Yeah, I'm actually going to start and just give you a little bit of a timeline as to this process that we've been going through. As you know, January 9th, there was a citizens initiated petition moratorium ordinance that was submitted to the town clerk, and she verified the signatures. So that was January 9th. At the select board meetings on the January 17th and then again February 6th, the select board and Bryce, they reviewed the timeline. There's very specific things that we have to follow. And so then March 19th, the select board held a public hearing for the moratorium ordinance to for the public, obviously. April 16th, there was a special town vote that was done by secret ballot, and the moratorium ordinance was passed. 86.2% of the voters that turned out voted yes to accept the moratorium ordinance. May 7th, the select board discussed the timeline moving forward, because then we were set with another time constraints and time constraints, I guess. June 4th, finally, the select board appointed a committee. So it took from January 9th, so just so you know, from January 9th until June 4th to have a committee appointed to begin working on any of the revisions of the ordinance, campground ordinances. After that meeting, Jim, our town attorney, Jim Katsourakis, he let the select board know that the moratorium is applicable retroactively to the day that it was proposed, which was January 9th. And so the town's position was that the date of the 180 days for the moratorium began on January 9th, which meant that it then ended July 7th. So considering the fact that the committee wasn't even appointed until June 4th, did not leave us a lot of time. The committee, with the 5 of us here, Patty Shy, myself, Betsy Clark, Ted Tucci, Lynette Stiniford, and John Yindra were the 5 that were appointed to the committee. So then June 18th, the select board held another public hearing. This was to extend the moratorium for an additional 180 days, which they are allowed to do. And after the public hearing, the select board passed that the 180 days extension began July 7th, I believe, and then it ends January 2nd or 3rd. So that's what our time frame is now. And so now we're kind of working backwards from, if we want to get all of this done before that January date, we have to work backwards to make sure we get all the other public hearings and town votes within that time frame. So since January 4th, the 5 of us as a committee have been working diligently. We have been intensively researching, that was 10 weeks ago. And in that time frame, we've met 8 times. We have a 9th meeting coming up on Saturday morning, we're gonna meet again after we get input tonight. We have researched campground ordinances and mobile home park ordinances from over 24 towns, most of them in Maine that are similar to Wayne. And particularly, we've really looked at the campground ordinance in Reedfield. We've researched a lot of information related to campgrounds in general, where they're heading, what campground structures are like, and what the future of that is looking like, so that we can update this ordinance going, really trying to capture things in the future. We have addressed our town ordinances, our regulations, and our comprehensive plan. We've taken all of those into consideration, and also the Maine State Department of Health and Human Services, which regulates campgrounds in the state. We've accessed the Maine State Land Use Planning Commission and the DEP. On July 25th, we met with Chip and we met with Bryce to roll out a draft to them and just meet with them and go over our work so far. And then on August 7th, we had our committee was instructed to conduct an informal public hearing, which we did. We had 2 members of the select board that attended that. We had 2 members of the planning board attended that. We had two people from management of Jellystone attended that, along with other public members as well. We presented our work. We took questions, listened to comments and input that was offered, and we will be considering all of that as we move forward, as we will tonight after we go through this with you. So that's our timeline, now we'll get into the meat of what we've produced so far.
Can I
So,
just do a quick follow-up to that?
absolutely.
So, just so that you set the stage so that we're all sort of operating on the same plane. The work product that we're here to discuss tonight, is, the, proposed amended ordinance, which is dated, July 29, 2024. We've given that to you in 2 forms, a track changes red line version, a clean version, and then in addition to that, we produced a draft report that explains how the committee viewed its charge, the work that we did, what our analysis was of the existing ordinance, and what we determined to be the deficiencies in the ordinance, and then an explanation for the changes that we're recommending in the proposed amended ordinance. So the documents that you have are the most current version of the documents, and you've had those for about 10 days or so. So we're all working on the same page. As Betsy indicated, our plan is to have a conversation with you, the planning board, tonight about our work product. Through that discussion, get input and feedback from you, any questions or issues you'd like to raise. And then we'll be meeting again to have the benefit of that input from both you and from the public information session that we had to produce hopefully what will be the final version for you to actually then formally act on in terms of the next steps you're recommending. So that's the work product. A couple, really 3 sort of general overview points, just to give you some context for how we got to where we are and why we got to where we did. The first is, and it's sort of obvious, but the amended ordinance really sticks with and adopts the framework of the existing ordinance. We looked at, as Betsy indicated, over 24 ordinances, some standalone ordinances, some as part of a comprehensive zoning or land use ordinance from different towns in Maine. We could have sort of, ripped up the existing ordinance and started from scratch. We decided not to do that. We didn't think it was necessary to do that. We thought we could make the improvements and enhancements and changes to the regulation of RV parks, campgrounds, and mobile home parks within the framework of the existing ordinance. So we kept the format, the structure, and large amounts of the content of the existing ordinance, and we've shown you where we made additions or changes to that. The second sort of major overview point that I want to emphasize is, we really felt that it was of paramount importance in terms of the work that we did to create an amended ordinance that was very clear in terms of how it worked with and integrated into the Wayne zoning ordinance itself and the subdivision regulation. It's always been our understanding that RV parks, campgrounds, and mobile homes are regulated by all three of those, or the standards that are contained in all three of those documents. And in no way are we suggesting that this amended ordinance is a standalone document. In fact, the opposite. What we're hoping to make very clear in the changes that we made is that it's one piece of an integrated regulation or regulatory scheme that you are to apply going forward if it's adopted in regulating this use in the future, both in terms of existing campgrounds in Wayne and any proposed future campgrounds in Wayne. So we wanted to make that very clear. There's a lot of regulation that already exists in the zoning ordinance and in the subdivision regulation that pertains to, and we tried our very best to sort of point the planning board to that within the body of the amended ordinance that we've drafted, so that it's easy to have those flags, if you will, or those road signs as you go through and look at the ordinance to refer to where in the existing zoning law RV parks and campgrounds are regulated, or where in the subdivision regulation there are existing standards that apply to how you should consider this use. And then the last major point that I think is worth saying, although I think it's obvious on its face, is that we really did form a very strong conclusion and belief that it's essential to update this ordinance, because it's been 50 years since there's been any meaningful change to it. And in our view, based on the work that we've done and the study that we've done, we really do think there's a significant and qualitative difference between what a traditional campground looked like in 1971 versus, what RV and recreational lodging resorts look like today. And we think that needs to be appropriately regulated in Wayne. So that's kind of an overview of the real highlights of why we did what we did and how the ordinance has been changed. We can, similar to what you did with the ADU, if you want to go through it section by section, we can do that. If you have questions, or we're ready to proceed in any way that works best for you.
Thank you. Well, I'm curious what the board thinks. I have read almost all of it. And it seems like it would take a long time to simply have it better explained to us. So my preference would probably be to proceed with questions and comments from us. Do the rest of the board agree? Or?
To agree with that, Ed and I were both at the presentation last week. So it was interesting because it was walked through section by section. It was interesting because there were some good comments that came from the audience. There was food for thought. And you've already stated you haven't taken that feedback yet and incorporated it into an updated document. You're going to wait until after tonight. But it was valuable going through it because comments were shared along the lines of, and if I was going to say, focus on a couple of things. One of them was being very careful to be thinking beyond current specifics, right? So if we were thinking about, the current state of the art in not an auxiliary dwelling, but a campground, whatever we're going to call it today, and what we might call it 10 years from now, try to be thinking more generally than being specific, because names can change and slight modifications can be made, and it no longer applies unless we update the ordinance again, right? So that was a great point that came up. And there was a question, I know Ed was the one who brought it up. Somebody probably gave it to you, but but it was clarifying the term commercial, right? It was a good one. maybe it would be splitting hairs, but I think, smart to make sure that everything is clearly understood. So that everybody, whether it's a current applicant, the next applicant, you know, anybody who comes up and says, we'd like to do this, everybody understands what the reality is. And I guess my point is, maybe the highlights in each section, but conversation, seemed to strengthen, I think in the opinions of you guys too, gave you good food for thought to strengthen what you've already put together and done a pretty good job. So maybe highlights. If these guys feel there are particular areas that they would want to call out in the sections as opposed to walking through for 2 hours.
Can I make, good,
Yeah.
there, sure. Well, nobody gave it to me, first of all. Yeah, I think what you're saying is correct, that we need to, there, you highlighted the areas of change, major areas of change. And I think that might be appropriate to, share thinking behind those, major changes. I'm gonna put that way, because they're, you know, and I'm not sure how, if they, and I've looked at this ordinance far too many times, land use ordinance and this also. And I'm not real clear yet whether there's any conflict between the proposed changes and what we currently have that was not changed. If there's any areas that we have to really review as a planning board before we make any sort of decisions around that. So anyway, I guess my thought is that it would be good, Jeremy, to maybe hear the highlights of the major, and I don't know how many you listed, I'd have to look. There wasn't that many, 7 or 8, wasn't there?
I'm sorry.
How many major changes? 7 or 8, right?
Yeah.
And then maybe you highlight what your thinking was around those areas only and not go through it paragraph by paragraph to bore everybody too much. No, I don't mean bore, I don't mean you're boring, I just meant that the material was lengthy, I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Oh.
That's my thoughts about it,
And if
that's all.
you don't mind,
Right.
before you begin, one thing I should have said before, in case anybody isn't clear on it, the planning board's role in this, to be clear, is not to approve or not approve. That's the planning board's role, is to make a recommendation to the select board. So the planning board does not actually have decision-making power here. We simply will make a recommendation to the select board, which will then decide how to proceed with it. So just so everybody understands the role tonight. So yes, do you feel like you can highlight, like you said, 7 or 8? Again, I have read it, and if anybody would like to read it, then
Yeah.
if anyone would like to hear the whole thing, then I suggest they read it.
We're
if you have
we're
a
not
couple,
gonna inflict that pain on everybody.
quick points you wanna
I
highlight.
I think the best thing to do is, why don't we just try sort of as informally as best we can to go through each section and give a brief comment on each section, and then to the extent you guys have questions about it, especially as we get into the areas where we're recommending what we would see as significant changes, you can ask us questions about that. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah, I have fairly substantive notes, and I can present them section by section if you like.
Okay, so, section 1, administration permits and definitions. You can see we've added some expansion to the purpose to make it clear, that what we're trying to do here is to integrate, the, mobile home RV park ordinance, into the other existing regulations, the zoning ordinance and the subdivision regulation. We want to make it clear that, you know, the town of Wayne has a comprehensive plan, and the comprehensive plan, you know, states what Wayne's objectives are in terms of, what its zoning code is supposed to accomplish. And, so we want to make clear that in our view, the changes that we are proposing in this, amended ordinance are consistent with and promote and further the goals of the comprehensive plan in terms of maintaining the rural character of the town, but also allowing reasonable opportunity for development. Definitions, section C, this is an area where we thought we actually made an improvement, because rather than creating the impression that the RV park and campground ordinance is a standalone ordinance, we want to make clear that in the zoning ordinance, there's pages and pages of definitions that have meaning and that apply to how you regulate RV parks, campgrounds, and mobile home parks. So all of those are the definitions that you should be using. They already exist in the zoning code. We didn't change them. We didn't do anything to them. We just simply make reference to them so that when you're considering applications, you know where to go to in the zoning code to look at appropriate definitions. There are a couple of definitions that didn't exist in the existing zoning ordinance that we have proposed to add to the specific proposed use of RV parks and campgrounds. And those are highlighted on page 2, the definition of RV park, campground, and mobile home park space. We thought it was very important as we get later into figuring out density and use requirements to have a definition of exactly what is a space on which a mobile home, an RV or other temporary structure that is used for RV park purposes can be placed. And then, as Ed pointed out, there's a definition in the zoning ordinance of RV park, and there's a definition in the zoning ordinance of campground, but there's no definition of an RV park campground. What we're getting at is sort of what an RV park campground looks like today. So we proposed a new definition that talks about an RV park being a facility that contains 2 or more recreational vehicles or other temporary structures, which we define later, used or rented for sleeping purposes by transients, tourists, or other visitors. We have included within that definition that any recreational vehicle or temporary structure that's in an RV park or campground space cannot exceed 400 square feet. We also wanted to make clear that when we talk about an RV park and a campground, we're not talking about an amusement park. We're not talking about a park and recreation area. And we're not talking about a facility that's used to host events for the general public. In our view, that's a completely different use than an intended use for an RV park campground, where people come for either a short-term or extended stay to stay overnight and use the facilities. So we thought it was important to make sure that distinction was clear in the definition section. There really was no definition of temporary occupancy. What does that mean? So we thought it was important to include that as well. And then, this I think is a big one, temporary structure. Again, the zoning ordinance has a definition of temporary, it has a definition of structure. We think those definitions are fine as far as they go, but they don't really get to the nature of what kinds of structures are currently in use in RV parks and campgrounds, and how might that change going forward? So to put some context to that, it really goes to the whole park model or park unit issue that we've been grappling with in recent times, how to deal with that. And we thought long and hard as a committee about, should we try to regulate park model units? Should we try to come up with an exhaustive list of the kinds of structures that can be put on an RV park or campground space? And frankly, the answer we came to is no, because nobody's got a crystal ball.
That's right.
You
Yeah,
can
a lot-
talk more about this.
Right, a lot of the research into these camping structures, they're just constantly changing, and you can call something a safari tent, or different kinds of tents. They've covered wagon tents and treehouse camping and this, that, and the other thing. And we thought, instead of trying to list all of those, we don't know what's going to come down the pipe next month, next year, 2 years. So we just thought staying with a temporary structure would hopefully encompass all of that.
So
That makes sense.
the temporary structure is defined in part to be any structure that is not permanent and is placed or installed on an RV park or campground space for occupancy and sleeping purposes. So again, we think this is very consistent with the intent of the Wayne Comprehensive Plan and what an RV park campground is supposed to be. To the extent there may be a fugitive campground, we think what the intent of the zoning ordinance is, and what's consistent with the comprehensive plan, is that any new or proposed facility that is to exist, if it's going to have those kinds of structures on it, they shouldn't be permanently affixed to the land. because that use could change 10 years from now. Maybe it'll revert back to some other use or whatever. We didn't want, or think that people in this town would want to have an RV park campground consisting of 20 or 30 or 40, permanent cabins affixed to the land.
And I don't mean to be rude or interrupt you, but I think we're gonna get into too much detail, maybe, and maybe what we need to do is be able to ask some questions as we go along. I think that's what our chairman maybe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Chairman, wanted to ask some questions or make comments. This is we're on page 2 and there's 13 more pages. That's all that I'm concerned about, that I think we've read it, or most of us have read it, and the people that are here would be able to read it, of course, and the changes. But what I was alluding to in my comments initially, that you summarized, there was 10 items that you listed in your summary of changes that you made. That's the ones to get into the weeds is for me. And please, the chairman can correct me, and that's fine.
And that was the most diplomatic direction to shut up I've ever heard. And they'll appreciate it. Thank you.
So, any questions?
May I, Chairman?
Yes.
So one, you guys have worked wicked hard and it shows and I appreciate it. Everyone up here does. So there's a couple of questions. I'm just gonna kind of rapid fire and, is my time up already?
Yeah, that's it, 3 minutes, done.
First one is for Mr. Cassiopakis. I'm sorry if I,
Jim is fine.
Jim, first one is for Jim.
It works.
I had a Hellenic boss in NATO. His name was Demetrius Mikulaiakos, and
There
it
you
took me
go.
a while to get that one right.
We said not Demetrius.
So Jim, first question is, how long does this panel have to absorb, digest, and process all of this hard work that these folks have done?
Well, it's a good question at the very outset. If you're just looking at this ordinance, the RV mobile home park and campgrounds ordinance, you have at least 2 months to make a recommendation to the select board. If any changes need to be made to the zoning ordinance, and I know none are proposed yet, but if there were to be changes to the zoning ordinance as well, you would have 4 months to consider that and make a recommendation to the select board.
Thank you, Jim. And now I'm gonna reference a Jim document. Again, I'm a process-oriented person, organizational leadership kind of guy, so his letter to you guys on the 4th of June recommended forming a committee constituting a stakeholder group representing ALEC, corporation members, campground abutters, town residents generally, and campground owners. So just of the 5, raise your hand if you're a member of ALEC. If you're campground abutters. If you're campground owners. So nobody from Jellystone was on your committee.
Correct.
Okay, fair enough. And how about town residents? Where's the folks from Richmond Mills Road, Lovejoy Pond Road, Innis Ridge, North Wayne? Town residents, but all around Androscoggin is my
I
point.
do not live on the lake.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I'm looking for a quilt,
Just-
a
I'm just-
patchwork full of
Just saying. I
the
don't
town of
know.
Wayne, but
To
okay,
be
thank
sure,
you.
that was my memo to the select board and
Yes,
in how they put together the committee,
okay.
and then they made the appointments.
Understand,
Okay.
thank you. And. Okay, that's it, thank you. Mr. Chairman?
Okay. So I guess I have a question as to how you would, I have lots of feedback. And my question is how it would be most useful to you. I have both. So some of it is very general, and then I have sort of broader comments by sections, and then I do have line by line commented.
Well, how about if we
On the
do this,
documents.
consistent with Ed's suggestion? I think it might be worth taking 5 or 10 minutes for us just to literally walk through the highlights so that you have the benefit of hearing us say it and then the audience has it. And then, Andy, that might be a good context for you to ask specific questions that relate to what we consider to be the major points or changes. Does that work?
That works. I do have some comments that are broad and
Yeah.
some that are also related to the preamble as well. So
Yeah.
there's, I guess you can decide when you would like those as well.
Right, so, do you have a copy of our report as
Yep.
well? So I guess that's where, those are the 10 points I think that Ed was talking about.
Yeah, let's start at page 4 of your report.
Yes, it is page 4 of the report, you're correct. Yeah. And so I think one of the biggest things that we wanted to accomplish was to integrate the mobile home park, RV park, campground ordinance. Integrate that with the subdivision regulations and the land zone ordinances and make sure that they're all, work together and it's not a standalone.
The second point, which really ties into that, again, is consistent with the idea that Wayne has a pretty well-developed, body of regulation around RV park, campground, and mobile home use. And we wanted to make sure that it was clear, in the amended ordinance, how the existing requirements that are in the land use table in the zoning ordinance apply to and govern, existing campground uses and any proposal for future uses. So, it's very clear that, in our view, the land use table governs and that, it limits potential future development of RV parks and campgrounds to the R3, R4 zone. And also reinforces pretty clearly the expansion of non-conforming existing, RV park or campground uses, in any other zones is not allowed. So we thought it was important to make it clear in the body of the ordinance that that's the case.
And the third point,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Are we asking questions if we have a question like about that or?
Think-
maybe?
I think what they propose is you're going to go through a section and then pause for our questions.
And then third, we want to make sure that it also was mentioned in the ordinances clearly that there is connection to the Maine Department of Health and Human Services and the state regulations that, that regulate campgrounds.
And we thought that was really important because frankly, until we had engaged in this study, we weren't aware of the Department of Human Services regulations that regulated campground uses. And we thought it was consistent with the general intent of the ordinance to make sure that it integrated any state regulation that applied to the campground use and made it clear that those were incorporated by reference into the regulation. The fourth point really gets to, the intent that this is a use that's intended to be seasonal. And we thought there were gaps in the existing ordinance about making that clear. And also the point we already talked about that by its seasonal, by nature of its seasonal use and its intent to be temporarily occupied, we wanted to make clear that we thought RV parks and campgrounds should consist of temporary structures in terms of the level or intensity of development.
And the fifth point has to do with not adversely impacting natural resources. And making sure that there's safe groundwater and other no disturbance to or minimal disturbance to wildlife, etc.
So the next point really goes to what we learned by looking at the Department of Human Resources regulation, which is, you have to think about this, not just in terms of how it regulates the land and how it may impact residents, but how does it impact or affect the customers or the people who use this facility? And we wanted to make sure that there were good standards in an amended ordinance to ensure that people who are patrons of RV parks and campgrounds have a safe and sanitary experience when they're there. But also that the people who live in and around that area are not unduly disturbed by that use. And so, that was again, a major focus behind how we recommended changes to lessen the impact of that kind of intensive use on people who may live in or be near the area.
And number 7 really addresses when we were looking at those temporary structures, limiting the size of those structures to no more than 400 square feet. Because as we were looking at the future of temporary structures, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so we felt that putting a cap on 400 square feet, a typical park model is less than 400 square feet. But we thought that was important to put in a cap for that.
And I can sort of do 8, 9, and 10 together.
Do it.
So 8, 9, and 10 sort of all go together. We had added significant detail and requirements to the recommended proposed amended ordinance that is geared toward protection of the environment, including requiring courtesy boat inspections, regulating campfire use, limiting use of phosphorus fertilizer, and generally, because Wayne's is characterized by so much heavily forested and natural land, we wanted to make sure that if a campground was proposed in an area like that in the future, it was done so in a way that had the least impact on the forested land as possible. So preservation of the existing topography, preservation of as much of the tree canopy as possible, that sort of thing. And then the last point really is the general overarching point, which is furthering the goal of protecting the rural character of the town, lessening burden on town resources, and also furthering the goal of protecting natural resources and environment. We thought that it was appropriate to include a standard in an amended ordinance that allowed up to but no more than 80 RV park campground spaces in any proposed development. With the idea that recognizing that each RV park campground space could accommodate a minimum of anywhere from 4 to 6 people, and then thinking about that in terms of the number of people that may be coming into town, using town facilities, traveling on the roads, and that sort of thing.
And I'm just gonna add one thing that we really worked hard at doing was focusing on what if there was a new development, proposed in the town of Wayne elsewhere. We did not, this in our minds, as we were working on this is not a Jellystone ordinance. I mean, I don't want it called the Jellystone ordinance. We really tried hard to look at if there was another tract of land over in this part of Wayne that somebody had 10 acres or more, except you need a minimum of 10, and they wanted to develop a new campground. What would you really want that to look like to blend into our community? And so that's where some of these that's where we came up with some of these kind of requirements and yeah.
Okay,
So
thank
if
you.
you've got questions or go.
I have a long list, so perhaps you would like to. You're gonna get it.
I just, when you went through point 2, I had a kind of like Robert's law question about that. And I think it is like probably gonna come up with other people, like how is the zoning ordinance, like making sure that they are interacting and that like the higher standard does have to kind of prevail. So when that's that point 2, where you say like reinforces that an expansion of non-conforming RV parks and campgrounds in other zones is not permitted. And maybe Jim could speak to this, or you guys would be able to answer this. So in the zoning ordinance, I felt like there was that section, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, that talks about like existing non-conforming uses, and then kind of references section C, like requirements for permitted expansion. And that's not going to be like a barrier or like conflict in any real way with this that you're proposing, since that seems less stringent to me.
I had the same observation.
You may have to make those work better together
Okay.
to get whatever the desired result is.
Because it just seems like that one would allow a lot of expansion that your ordinance is not hoping to allow.
What section are you referring to?
It's in the zoning ordinance, and it's Article 8, and then it's section C.
This is the permitted expansion of a non-conforming use.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously you can get guidance from your lawyer, but we'll try to make it as clear as possible. But I can tell you how we thought about it and why we thought it didn't create any conflict or any uncertainty. So, there are 6 different zones in there, right? In some zones, you can apply But you can have an existing non-conforming use in any one of those zones, right? Theoretically. In some of those zones, if you have an existing non-conforming use under the Wayne zoning ordinance, you can go to the planning board and say, the Wayne zoning ordinance tells me I can ask you for permission to expand my non-conforming use. In other zones, it says you can't ask the planning board for permission. The land use table, in our view, makes that as clear as it could possibly be. And it says very clearly that the only zones in which, if there's a non-conforming use that's a campground or an RV park, in an R3 or an R4 zone, then you can go to the planning board and ask for permission to expand that non-conforming use. It's very clear that in no other zone is anybody permitted to come to you and ask for permission to expand a non-conforming use.
this
So
is
we
a
don't think,
plan.
so the rules that are in the body of the zoning ordinance apply if you have a zone where you're allowed to go ask you guys for permission. If you're not allowed to ask for permission, then those rules don't apply.
So you're looking at just to be sure, the campground and RV park of the
land use
land use table
Page 8
there.
of the land use table,
Okay.
and your
I see you're seeing
definitions
it under like
make,
R5.
your definitions couldn't make it any clearer, where it says no, NO means the activity is not allowed in the zone as a new or expanded use.
So, but like if you're in the campground and the part that they're asking to expand is not within that, like not within like the R5 zone, for example, is that like a gray area? or is
Well,
that-
for example, if you already have something that's established, like, let's say a recreation building. It's already lawfully there. And they want to expand the building, they're not expanding the use, it isn't
just
a
the
new
building.
use. It's, they already have the use there, they're already, they just want to expand the building. You would look to see if the permitted expansion applies under C. And there, if you have a, with respect to structures, then you could have a permitted expansion of the structure.
Would you tell us where you
I
are?
wish I could give you a page number, but that's under C, C1,
Section 8.
C1A. And we had quite a bit of discussion of this in the context of the actual application before the application was withdrawn.
We did, yes.
Yeah, we did.
And
So
I would say that
it's something that
Perhaps following.
we have to be careful about when you're looking at this. And there are some, before we get too far into the weeds, there's some high level issues that perhaps we ought to try to work. Not issues so much as concepts we ought to try to understand where that, you know, that we understand what's going on and where this is going. And maybe if we could hit those high level concepts first,
I,
drilling down.
yeah, I just in general, I had the same thought on this, so let's definitely get there. Is that okay if we go to?
Yeah,
some
I just
general ones first?
was not like questioning it that I mean, I think that's the goal of everyone is to make it just like watertight. And I'm just hoping to make sure that it
Sure.
is.
I think it conflicts,
Yeah,
honestly,
okay.
I did not think it was in our current ordinances, so no, it was an issue that I would like to bring up again, but that's D, and we have, so I'll bring a couple general things, and then if you have anything that you think is important to raise at the beginning that I missed, let me know. So a few broad ones, as everyone else said, I very much appreciate the work and all the time you put into it and the nuance. There's a couple big things that strike me about it. One, this is a fairly substantive rewrite. I will be honest, a lot more changes than I expected. And partially because of that, I think it entailed a few things. One of them is that because we're changing a lot, more examination of those changes, I think, are necessary. And sort of as Doug brought up, but I will get more to the point, the makeup of the committee is not representative. It's fully ALEC members, which is not your fault by any means. But I do not think that that was a great choice on the part of the select board in terms of forming a representative committee. And I'll say why, because the changes here, they affect not just people on the lake, they affect the tax base, they affect people who work at Jellystone for one thing, some of those may be Wayne residents and there are jobs that we're talking about. And two, Losing my train of thought because I get nervous. Uh, Campground owners, and campground owners particularly, as you mentioned, you said this is not a Jellystone ordinance, this is an ordinance aimed, which will govern campground uses in the future, many of which will not even be on it, or not many, but which could entirely not be in Androscoggin. And the comprehensive plan specifically states that we want to encourage campground development in the town, that is in the comprehensive plan. And so to me, it behooves us to get input, for example, from campground owners, specifically because you've done a lot of research and I appreciate all the time you put in, but who knows best what allows you, if the comprehensive plan mandates us to, or suggests that we specifically encourage campground development in the town, then who better to ask what allows you to make a profitable campground than someone who owns and runs a campground?
And of course, what allows you to make a safe campground and a campground that doesn't harm the environment and a campground that also preserves the rural nature of the town. Those are important goals too, aren't they?
I'm not disagreeing, but perhaps you could let me finish.
Sure.
So, in any case, I think because these are wide-ranging, and fairly substantial changes, and because members of ALEP will not be the only ones represented, I think it is important to elicit other feedback, and I know you had an informal public hearing. I personally would be uncomfortable approving this without a formally noticed public hearing. So that other members of the town, I heard about that hearing the night before, for example, I could not go.
It went through, Bryce had it noticed in the Kennebec Journal, the Morning Sentinel. It was on the town website for the full 7 days prior.
Why don't we let the chairman
I
finish?
just,
Why don't we let the
but I
chairman
just
make-
need
Why don't
to,
we let the chairman make his comments and then we can respond?
okay, I just want to make sure that we did follow the letter of the law.
If it turns out that it was a properly noticed hearing, great. But I think it's important that there be essentially that we get that in. So that's a fairly broad one. Another sort of key one that came up right.
Would you like us to respond point by point? Because there's a couple of things that I think need to be said in terms of your comment.
Well, honestly, I'd like to keep this from degenerating into a back and forth. I don't think that serves anyone. You're under no obligation to take my suggestions seriously or to consider them correct. I think what would be most useful probably is for me to express what I think are the barriers for me to recommend this. Keeping in mind that does not need to be a unanimous decision by the board. And you can send it to the select board whether or not we recommend it. And if I'm the only one that has issues, then there's no problem. But I think if I give you my thoughts, you can choose to take them into account or not. And I have some questions also for Jim about how, I don't know if it's allowed for me to send a document with, line by line comments. Is there any way in which that is kosher legally
Well,
to give the committee like a document of my thoughts?
this is adopting and amending an ordinance is a legislative act. It's not a permit application. So it's something that can be discussed freely. We don't worry about ex parte communications. You could talk about it outside this room. It's okay. You could talk about it to the select board. But if you have some changes that you'd like to suggest to the commission, to the committee, you're certainly free to send those. But they are the comments of one board member. It's not the entire board, but it's something that you can take a look at and it might help you to see them rather than have Andrew, try to read them into the record, or if we don't have to be formal. You could send them, any board member could send your comments. The idea here is that the chair is suggesting that there be in the near future, perhaps you're going to have your meeting soon to try to set your draft and take these comments into account. Maybe next month at the next planning board meeting, there could be a formal public hearing with notice. And that would give people an opportunity to read it, to see what you've come up with and to review it and to make comments. But if you have comments you want to provide now, it's no harm in that.
So,
Well, can I just interrupt one second?
Sure.
So I think it would be very beneficial to have Andy give us his comments orally, because there are members of the public here and I'm sure they'd like to hear them.
Sure.
But of course, we welcome, whatever line notes or comments you have. And I think the council has indicated it'd be perfectly appropriate for you to provide us with that, so we
Okay.
absolutely look forward to that.
Great, that it seems less painful than going through each comment. So another question that seems important to answer early. It's, if I understood correctly, this contends that a campground application should be treated as a subdivision, whereas currently we say that sections, I think, H through K of the subdivision ordinance applies. My understanding is that a campground is not actually a subdivision. And we can't treat it entirely as such. And sort of in tandem with that, in several places, we say that the entire subdivision regulations apply. Whereas I think my understanding is that it's sections H through K that apply, and it is not substantively a subdivision. I guess, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, as a matter of state law defines what a subdivision is, and the state Supreme Court has refined that a little bit. There has to be a splitting off of an interest in property, a legal interest in property, and you know, renting a campsite for a temporarily is not a splitting off of an interest, and so it's not a subdivision. It has some qualities that are like a subdivision, and that you're worried about stormwater, you're worried about whether it's water, solid waste, all of those things. That's why H through K apply under the ordinance as it is. So we can't make it a subdivision, but it does get reviewed under those subdivision standards. And making that clearer is no harm in that.
I just want to comment, when I read through it, and I may be wrong, but I really read that their clarification on subdivision really had to do with definitions and clerical errors that might have been made in the original ordinance. I didn't see any change necessarily in the subdivision portion of the recommend, but that was my interpretation looking at it. All I saw was mainly, I think we made a couple spelling errors. These guys picked up on our spelling errors. Somebody made spelling
Well,
errors.
in section 1A4, not to get too granular, the last
Oh.
sentence, it says provided in Article 4, Section 11, RV park, campgrounds, and mobile home parks are considered a subdivision for review purposes.
Okay,
And also must continue to meet the subdivision standards. We'll make it clear, it's not under state law, but it is being reviewed under those provisions.
So, yeah, just making,
That's,
That's in there.
that's helpful. I think it's a drafting issue.
Sure.
It was never our intent to expand that to call a campground a subdivision.
Okay.
great. And I think the other, perhaps the end of the broad comments that I would make is I would, because these changes are so substantive and far-reaching within the ordinance, I think it is especially important, given their volume, to really clearly tie, because my understanding of the mandate is to fix a step, is to fix deficiencies in the current ordinance. And so it would be really helpful for me, I think, and it's, and sometimes the connection could be made a little stronger between the perceived weakness and the actual change. And particularly some of the points mentioned in the summary. I think there could be stronger logic between the derivation and conclusion. For example, the conclusion that because there is a 10-acre minimum for campgrounds, that the town wished to discourage the development of campgrounds or to limit the development of campgrounds, whereas the comprehensive plan specifically says that we should encourage the development of campgrounds.
The other page reference for that.
For the comprehensive plan, yes, it is in the introduction. It is introduction, you go down to the end, page 1, you go down 4 paragraphs under the plan proposes actions in 5 separate areas of town government. Point 3, local economy. Promote, attract, retain, and support the growth and potentially incentivize small businesses that strengthen our existing niches or economic clusters, et cetera, et cetera. Agriculture, recreation, campgrounds, summer camps, golf courses, boating, sailing, kayaking, swimming, hiking.
Now, if the intent though was to improve upon the existing ordinance, it could be a section that might this is not simply a rewording or refining. This is correcting an omission of something that 50 years after the original ordinance was put in place, we strongly feel is required to be putting in, correct? Doesn't have to be a direct. This needs to be clarified and improved upon. Could be. It's a lot of new text.
It's a lot of new text, I think it's, yeah, because of that, again, for me, and this is just my comments. Several of those points, if they felt like the initial point and then the action taken was not either some speculation was involved or there was not a clear and fully justified link. Which,
Just a little bit.
sure, sorry, which brings up one other thing that I thought should be important to point out. It says in here in one of the footnotes that Androscoggin Boys Camp does not count as a campground because the state regulates it differently. My understanding, and Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, but the state's categorization of Androscoggin Boys Camp does not influence our handling of them under our ordinances. And so they will still be regulated by this. And particularly if they've been informed that they won't be, they should be made clear. So that these ordinances will apply to them. And am I incorrect on this?
Correct, and they have been informed of that.
The reason being, you can have something defined differently for different purposes. And while it may have a different form of regulation under state law, the question for the zoning ordinance for the town, and for Chip as he's applying it, campground is any area or tract of land to accommodate 2 or more parties in temporary living quarters, including but not limited to tents, recreational vehicles, or other shelters. If that boys camp qualifies under that, then it's a campground for town purposes.
If I may, we run into this often. The state is the supreme, obviously. If they've made a rule, that's the rule. And in most of the rules, ordinances, regulations, if the town comes up with something that's more favorable to the intent of it, as what you're doing, trying to strengthen the campground ordinance, that is allowed. State is not going to stop us from putting in some, it's very common in shoreland. We have taken state shoreland regulations and we've fortified them quite a bit. So there is a difference there. And so there'll be a difference here. As long as it's more towards the intent of the legislation.
The town can be more stringent than state law with regard to the shoreland zoning areas under the state shoreline zoning law and the ordinance. But the important thing here is that sometimes they regulate different things. DHHS may be looking at different aspects of campgrounds as opposed to the town. And so they're coordinating their efforts, one would hope.
I appreciate that comment. I do think I need to respond to that. So first of all, thanks for the clarification. Obviously, the town and the planning board is free to adopt whatever interpretation you believe is correct with the advice of your counsel about what the existing ordinance does or doesn't regulate. And to the extent we were, as your advisory committee, were misinformed or misunderstood the reach of this regulation with respect to a summer boys camp, we can easily rectify that by removing the footnote from our report. I'll note that there's nothing, to my understanding and recollection, in any of the amendments that we propose that change anything with respect to the definition of campground. And so to the extent it's your judgment that the boys camp would be regulated by the existing ordinance, it would continue to be regulated by the amended ordinance. So I think that problem's been solved.
Well,
Great, yeah, just as long as that it's clear. And I think perhaps the final global point I'll make before I ask Jim if he has anything to add. The point you noted is that you tried to make explicit reference to the state's regulations, which are quite nuanced. And I guess here, and I might have to ask Jim how the law works around this, but that makes me a little bit nervous because to me, state law is state law and the state enforces it. It is not the town or the planning board's job to enforce state law. And so I don't know that it is wise to reference state law in our ordinances when state law already applies. That to me runs the risk of putting a double burden on the town in terms of enforcing state regulations and also potentially put an undue burden on an applicant if they have to satisfy double like requirements for the town that are already met by a SLOTA permit. There's, I don't know, do you have insight on that, Jim? Is that like a normal thing to do, or is that?
There are two things, well, yeah, state law applies no matter what this planning board does, no matter what this town does. It applies if you're operating a campground, you'd better be in line with the DHHS regs or you're going to have problems. If you put in that they also shall apply for any applicable state approvals, including DHHS chapter, and say that, you could put that in there. It's informational for an applicant. You're not going to enforce it. You're not going to review under it. You're just giving the applicant some warning that, hey, there's another thing you better go. Yeah.
It doesn't put a burden.
It
on us
doesn't
to
put a
go
burden on you.
to verify.
The danger in that is that it might be repealed, replaced, or whatever, and then it's out of date, and now somebody's gonna change that ordinance.
Mhm.
It's the only issue.
Okay.
on that.
If it doesn't place an increased burden on us, then I have less concern. There are some places where it feels like we're sort of restating anyways, and that I'd love to get clear on, like, what do they do for a SLOTA permit? And not have us ask them necessarily for the exact same thing, given the already satisfying that for the state, but that gets a little bit more into the nitty gritty. I think that's what I had for global. Thomas, is there anything similar to you on that thing?
Yeah, I've got a couple of global things, and here's where we're coming from. There are 3 ordinances out here that were cited in the moratorium petition. The subdivision regulations, which are really regulations that are adopted by the board until such time as an ordinance is passed. Then there's the mobile home park, RV and campground ordinance, and then there's the zoning ordinance. And I believe that a reasonable interpretation of the way they are now is that they all work together, but something that improves that is it's a good thing. The question is, what changes do you make? And the conceptual problem I identified for the town, the select board and the planning board, with that mobile home park, RV campground and campground ordinances, it really serves 2 functions. One function is, if you're a campground owner or a mobile home park owner, or an RV park owner, you've got to come into town and get a license annually. You have to get an initial license and you have to get a renewal license each year. And so the purpose of that is to make sure that as a business, public health, safety, and welfare is being protected. It's the water system operating, is the septic operating, and if not, then there's something that the town can do. The town can deny that renewal permit, and you can't operate for the coming year until that's fixed. So that's one purpose for it. That's what we call a police power ordinance, a public health, safety, and welfare. It is totally different from land use and planning, where you're trying to say, does its use meet these criteria, and you give a permit and that permit goes on for, reasonably forever. It runs with the land. Those are different things. What you would normally see in a zoning ordinance is you have listed uses like commercial, industrial, and then you have performance standards that apply to commercial. How much parking do you need? How much lighting do you need? What do you need? A lot of what's in this mobile home park, recreational vehicle park, and campground ordinance are performance standards that apply to that use. And you would normally find those as performance standards in the zoning ordinance. So in an ideal world, I don't live in one, but in an ideal world, you would have these performance standards in the zoning ordinance along with the uses that are in the table. And so that's where these might go. And so you could have a mobile home park, recreational vehicle, and campground ordinance that's an annual licensing provision to give some teeth to the ordinance so that, Chip could say, I'm sorry, but your septic system isn't working and I can't allow you to operate this season until it gets fixed, which is totally different from your land use that's allowed to get a permit and build and operate. And so, and that's just conceptually, it would. And I mention that because at the same time that this is going on, the town is codifying all of its ordinances with a code company. All of its ordinances, and looking to see where things could be better situated and how they could be more easily understood by the public. So that it's an organizational issue, but that's just a problem I noticed, and this doesn't, this just continues the problem, it doesn't resolve it.
Well, so I guess that's very helpful in terms of, you know, having your background and expertise in zoning law. I guess I'll say this, we were a volunteer advisory committee. We were formed at the direction of the select board. We were given a specific charge, which was to review, analyze, and propose amendments to an existing lawful ordinance passed by the town. And that's exactly what we did. The existing ordinance in effect in this town, which we kept the same structure, has both performance standards in it and has police power standards in it. And we kept that. Now, if the town's lawyer's recommendation is that's a bad way to do things, fine by us. You can make a recommendation that there be a comprehensive review of Wayne's zoning ordinance and that it be amended, and that all of these performance standards that are in the ordinance get put right in the zoning ordinance, and then we won't have a problem. We don't have the authority to do that, and that wasn't our charge. So we did the best we could to make sure those performance standards, which we think are extremely important to regulate what is a use that nobody thought of 50 years ago when they thought of pitching a tent on the shores of Androscoggin Lake and camping, or driving an RV up to a site and dropping a fishing pole in the lake, versus the way that modern RV park resort lodges operate today. So we think it's extremely important that those performance standards be updated, whether they're updated in the form of a standalone ordinance that is clearly incorporated into the land use ordinance. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is, as you suggest, Mr. Katsakikis, and we have no authority to implement that.
Yeah, and again, I don't mean to be critical of your efforts in that format. I understand. Initially, the issues were identified as to all three ordinances. And so there is an opportunity here to try to fix things, make it that much easier for folks to understand and perhaps to implement and to administer. So that was just a thought. And again, not criticizing the group, but just trying to explain, this is, from my perspective, you have this ordinance that's got dual functions, and one of them may be better in another place.
Right, but Jim,
Can I
no, I'm
make
sorry.
a
I
point
have
of
to
order?
finish.
No, that's
We looked at over 24 ordinances in Maine. And I think we're fully informed about the concept of performance standards and how they exist in land use ordinances or zoning ordinances. But respectfully, unless somebody can direct us otherwise, our charge wasn't to amend the Wayne zoning ordinance. So I think our hands are tied.
Okay, I thought you were looking at that as well, so I didn't understand that. And then just another big picture issue. As I read through this, you're using the defined term RV park / campground. And I didn't quite understand until tonight that it really, are you thinking of that as being something different from the standard campground that's in the zoning ordinance? I'm just trying to get my head around it, make sure I understand what you're saying here. I noticed there's a specific definition of an RV park campground. A commercial facility containing 2 or more recreational vehicles or other temporary structures used or rented for sleeping purposes by transient tourists or other visitors. And then there's a space requirement that it can't, or the area requiring can't exceed more than 400 square feet. My question is this different from the campground as defined in the zoning ordinance?
Yes.
Okay, then the use RV park / campground is not defined in the zoning ordinance, so it's not regulated or allowed or prohibited anywhere.
Mm,
It's defined in, we thought we resolved that issue by defining it in the amended ordinance, which would be voted on and become law in the town of Wayne. I can explain our thinking.
Well,
So,
just thinking that doesn't amend the land use table. in the
You're talking
zoning
about, like,
ordinance.
that's just that the land use table does not say,
It does not say
more of a-
RV park /
more of just a
campground.
clerical issue that the land use table doesn't have the same language.
Right, and so it would wind up regulating a use that isn't even contemplated in the town, it just doesn't. So that's actually creating a new disconnect between the two ordinances.
okay, that's an interesting point. We can certainly look at that, although it does reference in it the existing ordinance, which I think arguably suggests that whatever use is defined in the existing ordinance is governed by the land use table.
Well,
But
I understood, but if you look at the land use table, it talks about campgrounds and RV parks, but they are separate, they're separate. There is no campground, RV park / campground as you're defining as a use that's allowed or prohibited anywhere in town.
okay,
So you might want to work on that coordination.
So if it was worded as, campgrounds and RV parks instead of RV park / campground,
Well,
the way it's in the table.
I'm trying to figure out are you creating or looking at a specific type of use that is a campground that consists of an RV park?
I think she's asking if they just changed it to campgrounds and RV parks, like in the table.
Yeah, I
With
mean,
that-
you could follow the table, you could follow the land use table and those definitions in the zoning ordinance. And that would coordinate the two a little better.
I think you're saying that the campground and RV park already has a definition in our zoning ordinance, is that?
Right now, campground has a page
Has a
48.
page 53.
49.
Page 53, the definition of campground, quote, any area or tract of land to accommodate 2 or more parties in temporary living quarters, including but not limited to tents, recreational vehicles, and or other shelters. In our view, that definition clearly was standing alone, was clearly insufficient to explain, to encompass or regulate a modern RV park use. And what we learned in our research is that many zoning ordinances specifically differentiate between what I'll call commercial campgrounds and wilderness campgrounds, private campgrounds. And this definition struck us as much more along the lines of intending to regulate somebody who was not operating a campground as a business, but intended to have a campground space on property that they own. Do I have that distinction correct?
Well, I understand the distinction you're making. What I'm suggesting is that distinction doesn't exist in the zoning ordinance right now. And so you may have to do some
So,
proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance
Right.
to incorporate the new definition. And maybe you want to limit campground to being the traditional camp with the tent. And then have an RV park as something different, or I don't know what, but I'm just tossing those ideas out.
Right, because I'm looking at definitions, so you're right, in the zoning, there's campground and there's a definition for recreational vehicle. But there's not a definition for an RV park.
Right, and maybe that's what you want to create. I don't know. The petitioners are the ones who identified deficiencies in the ordinance. Because that had to be done, you identify them broadly in your petition. And it was voted on by the voters, and so, one thing that I think was asked by the chair early on was, what were those deficiencies, so we understand what you're addressing? Those deficiencies and the inadequacies in public infrastructure were broadly described in the petition. We've never really gotten a full definition of, well, what exactly are the weaknesses? Where are the problems? Not line by line, but generally. And what are the deficiencies in the public infrastructure that are exacerbated by a proposed mobile home park or by, not a mobile home park, but by an RV park or by a campground? And so just some things to think about. One last bit that I'll leave with you. Mobile home parks are an interesting situation every town in Maine is required to provide some areas where a mobile home park can be located or expanded. And that's a state law requirement, it's a mandate. And so, and with regard to mobile home parks, there are limits in state law on what towns can review. They get a smaller minimum lot size, smaller frontage requirements, smaller setbacks in order to allow those to go on. So any changes that you propose to this ordinance for campgrounds and RV parks, be careful about changes that you make with regard to mobile home parks, because they really are something that the legislature back in '89, when we were worried about growth management for the first time, made sure that municipalities were preserving, and they really were forcing municipalities to recognize the right of those to exist and expand, even though now they're being sold off and well, but anyway, just something to be careful about, that's all. We don't want to hurt the town with regard to required state mandates with regard to mobile home parks while you're trying to fix the ordinance.
I had questions around that in a few places, but I was not, did you see anything in there that would potentially get us in trouble? I didn't-
Couple of things that
And
I'll hold off till we see a final draft.
Yeah.
It would help us to know what they are.
Yeah, before we do it, because we sort of went through what Richmond has in place at this time, that was one of the town
Okay.
ordinances that we followed. As well as checked with the state ordinances on sizes. And I believe they're called manufactured homes now, since 1976.
Right.
We should change that name to manufactured homes.
Right.
Perhaps, do we need to do that?
It would be a good idea,
Okay.
just to make it more consistent with current law.
But it would really help us if you have concerns to know what those are.
I'll send
We
those
can't do
along.
anything about them. until we know
Understood.
what they
And
are.
this has been our first conversation, so
Okay, that's fine.
as I see those, we'll pass those along, but just as you'll be sharing your draft. So I'll shut up at this point. I've spoken too much.
No, thank you. And something I would also just love to emphasize is I know it is an unpleasant experience when you spend a lot of time on something to have to put it up and have people essentially come up with, criticize it. I do understand that. But I would like especially encourage you, like you mentioned, like it is a committee of volunteers. You know, we take Jim's feedback out of somebody with a lot of experience, you know, less more knowledge certainly than I do on this, or I think anybody on the board, and because I would encourage you to take his thoughts as efforts towards making the ordinance better rather than as criticism of your efforts, which is, I know it's hard to put your work out there and get feedback.
Any problem we're looking at, right? Very generally speaking, you can look at it from, okay, here's the current reality and I want to improve upon this, or you can look at it from another direction and say, what would Nirvana look like with this situation? I think you guys came at this, and I totally respect this, not just taking, you said yourselves in different words, but not just taking exactly what was on paper. You were thinking bigger. And where I think that fits here, and I think there's merit to a lot of the things you guys are talking about, if they don't belong though in the RV campground ordinance, but they might be long in the zoning or in the subdivision, I don't see any issues at all with just getting some guidance and say, you know what, this really belongs here. And that would just be, and I think you mentioned it yourself, right? You know, just, this would be a recommendation that to align with your proposals for the RV campground ordinance. These would be the changes that would work very well if collectively everybody agreed, you know what? Overall, this is a smart plan. But logically, the same way we're having the third party now looking at all of our ordinances to see, should this be put in a different place? Should it be clarified? Should some of the languaging change? We'll be doing that in parallel with the same activities going on across the board. Right? So this is good. So it's just really, we need swim lanes. And I think any guidance we have, if we're color coding, this is more land use, zoning ordinance, this is subdivision, that would probably also be helpful for you guys. So we don't go through this again and something gets pulled out or pointed out as, no, cross that out. So whatever guidance we might be able to give. Let's try to provide that for these guys.
That's what we need. We
Yeah.
need that. We're asking.
Yeah.
We want
Yeah.
you to help us.
And I think what Jim was saying was that you can, even though you weren't charged with recommendations for the land use or for the zoning ordinance, that you can imply that this might be better. Am I correct, Jim? That would be, even though they weren't charged, I mean, we will be recommending it sometime either for, against, or at, or not. And we'll make that recommendation at some point.
The moratorium ordinance identified deficiencies with all three ordinances. So
Correct.
that, it was in this context, and I think it's appropriate for the committee to suggest, if you wish, changes to the three that, and make sure they're consistent that way and work together better.
Can we ask you a question regarding the moratorium ordinance, or is that not applicable for this meeting? I may not be, so. And in regard to timing and stuff like that,
It's still ongoing. It was extended for another 180 days.
till
Yeah.
January.
Or sooner
Whatever.
if something's enacted in the meantime. To be clear, though, just so that we understand, I know that, some folks would like to see this acted on in November. In order for this to be acted on in November, we'd have to have a recommendation to the select board, and the select board would have given the language to the clerk to put on the ballot by September 6th. It's not going to happen.
We know that, we know that.
And it's not because anyone's dragging their heels.
Right.
It's simply,
Very good.
that's the process.
And to follow Ed, our understanding is that the select board can grant another additional 180 days. They can continue to do 180-day increments as long as it will work.
So long as the
we work
emergency that gave rise to the ordinance still exists,
with-
and
Yes.
the town is making reasonable efforts to try to address the issue.
If I may. I think that's where better defining the shortcomings that brought on the moratorium ordinance, better defined. Would be helpful in doing this. So when it comes time, if you need to extend the moratorium ordinance, you're gonna have to justify that. Justify it by referring back to what the weaknesses were and how they haven't been addressed yet. One other comment is, I'm getting letters in from the public, which will be put on the website. I got copies here for you. But I would suggest if you have anything substantial, get it to me so I can get Bryce to put it on the website under your section. And that way you have it, public has it, and that would be very helpful. Go.
Okay. I'm only, for the moment, I only want to take comments from the committee members, assuming you're not on the committee, sir. So I don't,
Want to finish up with board member comments?
yeah, I guess I was thinking take some more board member comments and then perhaps
Anyone who wants to speak,
we just sort of limited time. I don't know how long I want this,
2 minutes each.
and well, I guess I would like to, well, I'd like to bring up the conflict of public hearing. Should I keep going? Do you still other people have things on there?
Can I ask a broader swath question again? Like,
Yes.
are we recommending then that, I know we've talked about having some, we're hiring, I can't remember the name of the organization to
Code.
look over our code. And then we talked about how we were gonna have to like make changes, like, give them kind of substantive stuff that they would want to change. So are we thinking that we're going to move forward with looking at our zoning ordinances and making changes? And like, what time frame are we thinking for that? Or are we charging them kind of with like suggesting that they might make changes to that zoning ordinance?
The organization is called General Code.
Yeah.
And General Code is basically trying to find conflicts, find new state statutes that might conflict and everything. They will not write
Yeah.
anything, any verbiage or anything. But what they're gonna do is they're gonna come back with all our ordinances, torn apart, probably using AI, and then put back together in a format that's easier for the public and for anybody, like in this thing, to use. Now, in terms of that, we started that effort back in February, I believe. And then subsequent to that, they asked us for what ordinances we'd like to have them work with. So, they're working on that. They'll probably have something in October. And I'm gonna need volunteers from your group when it comes back so we can work with them on it. But in terms of when this is, pushed forward by the select board and the subsequent town meeting, then this would be handed over to them as a project to incorporate again, whatever's new. And again, tear it apart and see if there are still conflicts that our esteemed, attorney might not have found. Or might, come up, but by no means are they gonna write anything. They're gonna
Oh,
come back and say, you got a problem here, what do you suggest? And this is where,
And I guess that's my question is, are we as a planning board, do we have anything in mind about looking at the zoning ordinances ourselves? Or are we, is that like not on our radar in the coming chunk of time?
We do. And then we'd be a committee, I think, to work with, whatever it is, but not affecting this.
Yeah.
Out of scope.
Okay.
This here. I have a couple more, I guess, a couple more things that I might like to ask with. I have a bunch of things I can send them to you as a document, but there's a few that might be nice to have, like, again, here for, to tell me if I'm off base or not. One, in the definitions section, in a few places in the definition, there's essentially regulation within the definitions. Things like no temporary structures. Sorry. Temporary structures are not permitted in mobile home park. And
Or like the maximum square footage of a
Yes.
recreational vehicle within the
That was-
definition, that could be a standard rather than. the
I have a note there
Yes.
too, taking out, the rules and regulations out of definitions, and those should be elsewhere.
great.
Yes, yeah,
Great.
I got I'm full of sticky notes.
Fabulous. Yeah, so, all right, that was one. Jeannie's point under the permitted use, maybe my slightly different way to say that is that, I guess put that whole section for the permitted use, like the purpose that I see there is you're basically summarizing the land use table, which I think can be useful. The one thing that I think is where we get into danger is, again, the expansion of the structure and expansion of the use in the R1, 2, 5, 6 zones is prohibited. I think that could be sort of a dangerous gloss over what is actually more nuanced, because as we referenced in the ordinances, if you look under their existing non-conforming uses, including in those zones, there are some expansions that are permitted. And that's like, that's how the ordinance is, that's how we read the ordinance, and so.
I'm having an awful hard time here.
Sorry. If you look at the section of our ordinance, of our land use ordinance, where we talk about permitted expansions for existing non-conforming uses. There are some expansions which are permitted. It's somewhat nuanced. Again, we got deep into this with some of our recent work. And so I just think that because in this section D, you're essentially replicating the land use table, to me, that is useful in terms of just making it easier to understand. But in that sentence, I think it obscures some nuance, which could create conflicts in the future. And so my suggestion would be leave that to the land use ordinance where it's actually dealt with.
Excuse me, can I just comment on what you just said? Because I think you're correct. There is, and I looked at the same thing, and it was one of my questions, which I didn't get to ask yet, by the way. The expansion, because I think what they were talking about, expansions of use. And not necessarily, well, they did say structures, I think, in your proposed ordinance too, whereas our current land use ordinance does allow for expansion away from in certain zones, so shoreland, resource protection zones. It allows expansion of structure as long as it's outside that 100-foot zone, I think it is. So yes, I think it conflicts the proposed changes with what is certainly there, and we'd have to change one or the other, I would guess, or probably our land use ordinance. So, but not to confuse that with expansion of use, which also it's very limiting, I think, in the current guidelines in that section 8, where it says intensity and density, and they give you some ideas on how to measure it. And I think you did look at density, and I don't remember exactly what it was, number of units per acre and some other things. But I didn't hear or see anything about intensity. And I wondered if you guys looked at and intensity to me is different than density, and I'm not sure. But intensity might be the volume of, whatever. Other activities other than camping, I suppose, which I think you did mention things like mini golf and maybe paintball shooting or what, I don't know. Are those an intensity of use, not a density? There was no mention of that I recall. Is that?
We can certainly go back and do more to flesh that out, but it was very much our intent, to make proposed, recommendations that did provide some standard and guidance with respect to both density and intensity. So for example, the limitation or the standard of no more than 7 RV park or campground spaces per acre, that would be a density restriction. And we wove into that, that the way you measure an acre is you don't look at an acre as an acre. You look at what's the features and characteristics of the land within that acre. If it's a wetland, if it's got land that's within the high water mark, you don't count that. If it's an archaeological dig resource, you don't count that. So that's one example of how we thought about density. With respect to intensity of use, one aspect of that is what you said, which is how are the people who are going to be there making use of the facilities within that use? That's we think a legitimate aspect of regulation in terms of intensity of use. But intensity of use is also, you have a town of 1,100 people. What kind of facility do you think is appropriate to have in a town of 1,100 people in terms of the number of people who might be there on any given day? And so in our view, at least, intensity of use is what is the number of folks who may be there on any given day? Sleeping there, using the facilities, recreating on the water, having meals there, using the sanitary facilities. All of that goes to intensity, in our view, intensity of use. And what might be appropriate for a town of 1,100 people might, or a town of 12,000 people might not be appropriate for a town of 1,100 people. At least that was our judgment. Yeah.
When does a campground become a resort? I guess a resort is an end user. Is there any definition?
We didn't want to wade into that. That's a value judgment. We tried to look at, rather than putting labels on stuff, we tried to look at how are things really used today? What is a prototypical facility like this look like today? And the judgment we came to is that it looks a heck of a lot different than it used to 50 years ago. And the use is a lot different. It's much more intense than it used to be.
And we did research, resort ordinances to come up with a zoning, a definition to be used in zoning ordinances for resort. There's, we weren't about to create one because we could not find one to guide us on that. I think what we tried to do was then put in the restrictions of no more than 10% of the square footage of, of the whole
Lot.
10% of the parcel of land, no more than 10% should be used for recreational facilities, buildings, and other structures other than the campground spaces. So putting in some of those kinds of restrictions, I think we tried to address the big water park resort issue.
Okay. In the interest of us not necessarily being here all night, I guess I'd like to talk a little bit about the rest of the meeting. And so it sounds like a few more of us have some comments. I have some I have specifics that I can send you. I have a few broad ones that I could go through, perhaps rapid fire, just for you to hear them, and so if Jim has any flags that I'm off base, he can say them.
You can share those with us too, Andrew.
Yes, I can share them all in document form with you. But perhaps before we do that, one thing that might be good to actually discuss is well, two things. I would like, so I think there, it seems unclear, I guess, whether this last hearing was properly noticed. I'm not sure if that has been established. I personally would, given the depth and extent of the changes to the ordinance, and because this is will be a permanent document moving forward. I think it's important to take the changes fairly seriously, and I would like to have a public hearing.
We're very
This
confused.
body will, yes.
We're very confused.
But
Go
I
ahead.
will say it was properly noticed. The select board and Bryce went through the timetable. They did post it. It was posted. I know Bryce didn't send an email out to the town email list until the day before, but it was publicly noticed the full week prior to that with all of the documents online. Now, also in our charge from the select board, is that there will be a formal public hearing that the planning board will run. And then it will go to the select board, and the select board will hold another public hearing.
Okay.
So there are multiple layers of public hearings.
So we're planning on another public hearing with the planning board.
Yes, that's
great.
what we were told would
So
happen.
perhaps we should schedule that tonight. Would that be appropriate?
So it would be appropriate. I think the question is there's some changes that you folks are going to be making to your draft. And after you have your listing session and after tonight's, when will that be ready so that could be made publicly available? Before a public hearing?
We gotta get.
Guess
the
what?
Comments.
Chicken or egg?
Tell us a date when you can
Yeah.
get us everything you want to give us.
Well,
Everything's got a time.
here. The way this is supposed to work is that the committee comes in with a proposal, the planning board accepts the proposal, calls a public hearing, and takes comments and then makes a recommendation.
Yeah.
I think the planning board is trying to be helpful here, to provide some input so that, you have the best proposal that you can to present, and then the process goes on. So if we were to say, this normally you meet the third Thursday of the month. So that would be September 19th, I believe. And so you'd want to have all of this ready the week before in order to be able to get it to the public, so they have time to read it, put it up on the website. 2 weeks.
I might make a suggestion here. Seeing as there's been a recognition on all parts, this probably is not gonna be a November finish, okay? That we have one more public meeting where we can get this there's quite a few things here, where we can get this smoother and have a public meeting, and then for the public hearing, which could be scheduled subsequent to that, we have a better document and a format to give to the public before that. I'd suggest, well, it's up to you all, but I'd suggest another public meeting occur, because there's so many things that happen.
Another meeting like this
You're right.
is an opportunity for you to say, here's our new and improved draft. Board members can respond with questions, get some comments from whoever's here. And then maybe October, have a clean enough draft in a final enough state that can hold a public hearing. Does that sound like a fair way to proceed?
Is that, how does the committee feel about that? Is that acceptable to the committee?
We want to do whatever you think makes the most sense.
We're not rushing to, I know it was mentioned to try and get it on the November 5th ballot for election day, decent turnout, but that is not something that we need to.
Let's get it done.
Make a much finer product.
That's very reasonable. Thank you.
Exactly.
Do we have any suggestions to offer if there's been concern expressed about, let's say, lack of representation in some important constituent parties? How might we get input from the board to be able to
Just
factor
for
in?
clarification, we invited some campground owners to come to our meetings.
Mhm.
They did not. The Jellystone had representatives at our informational hearing, which went on for 2 hours, and they participated meaningfully in that process. Consistent with at least the expressed desire of one member of the planning board, we're gonna reach out to the Sun Beaverbrook folks directly and invite them to come to any meeting they wanna come to and to offer any suggestions or comments or criticisms they may have. And they're more than welcome to take that to come to any, all our meetings have been public in any event, but we will extend an express invitation and request that they participate in the process.
And I will say the select board, following what they were given for direction, the select board publicized, looking for people who wanted to be on the committee, and they took applications. So that was on the town website, that was posted, they collected applications, just like they collect applications for the hiring committee and some of these other committees. And from the, applications they got, which weren't a lot.
My impression was 5.
There were more than 5.
There were more than
5.
There were more than 5, but there were no
But there were
applications
no
from any
no
citizens who worked at Sun Beaver Brook.
No
And nobody
applications from campground
owned
owners that put in to be on the committee, so the select board chose members from those who submitted applications, so they followed the process of having publicly noticed. All of our meetings have been publicly noticed on the website for anyone to attend as well. So we tried to follow that whole freedom of information, freedom of access process.
I
Thank
have
you.
spoken with campground owners
Mhm.
in the area. And I didn't approach Jellystone because I felt we were very much aware of how they felt about what a campground should be. They have a permit in front of us. We have seen the information they have presented, what they would like to have. And I felt there was almost a little bit of a conflict, so I didn't, but they did come to our meeting, and our meetings have always been posted publicly. Anyone that wants to come could come. We've had one person attend about 8 of our meetings. And it was a private citizen that showed up. And we always made sure if we had to go downstairs in the library, we left a note on the door, we're downstairs, ring the bell or whatever. So I talked with, the people at Riverbend, Nate, and got her opinion on what does she think a campground now would look like? Because that campground has been there on Riverbend for a bit. It's not in our, it's in Leeds, but they do share the lake with us because they have the bass fishing tournaments that happen. They launch out of there. They have their own inspectors that come with them. They make sure everything's clean on those boats before they come into Innispot Lake. And she did talk about lot size, and I expressed to her, well, these are some things we're thinking about. And do you think these are appropriate for someone to be able to be in business and survive? Because we're not against business. The only thing I think all of us want is we want a town that maintains the look that we all love. It's a quaint little village. And that was her response to me. It's a quaint village. And I can't imagine it changing because it's become overrun with too much commerce. And I know we need it. I know we need all the income we can do, but there must be some other ones. So I enjoyed her conversation and her experience because she has worked in other campgrounds throughout the United States. And she has tried to maintain it that way. Winthrop also, I spoke to them, husband and wife team. Again, also, both of those places I asked about there. Do you have security on site? Yes, there's somebody there 24/7. So things that we've incorporated into this. We did try to cross that into people in the area that have a common main, bond to all of it. Then I talked, actually, I had forgotten about them. Further, I went a little bit further to bigger areas like Bar Harbor and to Harrington, Maine, to their campground. And they feel even if you had 40 sites in a camp, that you could still make a living. And camping means different things to different people. Do you want to go camping like we remember growing up, where you had tents and you had the basics, or do you want to resort like Old Orchard Beach? Old Orchard Beach does not belong, I feel, and I think many of the people we've spoken with in this town. So when you say define a resort includes all of the amenities. And we will try to clarify that as best we can, but please give us any of your suggestions so we can consider them.
I would like to keep this moving. Is the comment absolutely necessary?
Just for the record, July 31st is when when the notice for our public hearing was posted in the.
Okay,
Right,
great.
I just wanted.
thank you. I will reiterate when I say that I'm just taking right now from the committee members. When I expressed that I think it is unfortunate that the committee is not more representative, as I said, I'll reiterate, I don't mean that as a criticism of the committee. I know you did not choose yourself. And not necessarily even the select board, as you said, not many people may have applied. And it sounds like you did do more talking to campgrounds than was necessarily clear from the document, but something which would be helpful to me is when I look at a lot of these numbers, I do not run a campground. I don't know if they're reasonable. And I don't know if I don't know where they came from. I don't know if you had 4 campground owners look at them or if they just seemed reasonable to you. And that to me, when we're talking about, again, basing it on the comprehensive plans, impetus to encourage small business campground development, the idea that a new campground comes in, they will be governed by these, create an ordinance in which they can make an actual living, employ people, et cetera. And so I would love to hear, I would love to see specifically, like, what, maybe when you see my questions and you can say who you ran them by, because I would be clear, it does not need to be a campground owner for me. Like, I would love to have any campground owner at our public hearing to ask questions of. It doesn't, in my opinion, need to be someone from Wayne, even like just somebody who runs a campground, because they know what it takes and what is reasonable. And, I'm not an expert on that. You are more experts than I am, but you still are not campground owners. They have a lifetime experience.
When we were going through the solar ordinance, when we were going through that process with everybody, I was under the assumption going in, thinking I'd read everything that, well, there are farmers and there are people who want to buy farmland and put solar panels on it. And then we had farmers saying, whoa, hold on, solar panels are my retirement plan. That completely blew me away, and I realized it's really good to hear from both sides of the argument, because you can really be dismissing some very valuable information.
And it was positive when Jellystone, 2 representatives showed up at our public meeting. And they had some really good comments and they sort of liked what we had done. And it was good to hear positive from them as well. And we told them, we appreciated them.
Are there minutes from that meeting?
We have some, yeah.
Well,
We have some.
Well,
and I would say that, I mean, we pulled from conversations and from ordinances. We didn't just make up numbers and statistics and things to put in here because we liked them. We looked at ordinances that had, parameters to them, and I don't see how restricting a campground, to 80 campsites is taking away anyone's ability to set up a campground in the town of Wayne. It's just, 80 campsites is a lot of campsites. And we're not saying it's not so restrictive that somebody can't take a parcel of land and create a campground. Does that make sense?
it does. I don't want to.
Right.
To keep it like, my point is, I don't know that.
Okay.
I don't know what it takes. to
But the
run a campground.
restrictions and the setbacks and things like that we put in here are very common in other ordinances. So that from towns where campgrounds do work.
Okay, yeah,
Just-
and that's something that you can certainly clarify in response to some of these. But I would like to try to get you as much feedback as we can.
Yes.
Before the next meeting. So I might suggest that, like, rather than respond to each piece of feedback offered, think about it. If you think it's off base, then you can, tell us that when you come back, or if you have a real quick reason, but, yeah. Ideally, not a pull, if we can keep the back and forth down, that'd be great. I have points, but I have lots of other people have things that they would like to bring up.
One question and one proposal? The question is for Jim, and I hope I'm not out of bounds, but I'm gonna use a bad swear word here. I assume the Jellystone folks are preparing for litigation. Can you comment on anything from them?
It's not about.
I know, I
Well,
do my own
Yeah,
edification.
no, we're trying to keep the two processes divorced in the sense of, there's a permit that's on hold, in a sense, the application was withdrawn. And this is about. I've not seen anything.
Okay,
There's no. there's
So
no
they've been
complaints.
quiet.
They've been quiet. They're probably looking to see what comes out of this as well.
Fair enough. Okay, I think red, I think blue. I just
No, I
try to
understand.
anticipate what's coming down the
Yeah.
pipe for our beloved town.
Yeah.
And the proposal, if I may, or want me to wait?
Don't know what it is.
After that,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Tell us what it is, then we'll decide.
What's
No, the proposal is we take the work that the advisory committee has given us. And we take it and we digest it and we close this meeting. Sir,
I think, well, I guess my question would be, does the committee, other people have a lot to say, or do you want me to run through my substantive things while Jim is here to call my fouls? Okay, and
And we'll be fine.
I will not
I'm
take,
asking-
I will not take silence as agreement, and again, I don't have to agree. For you to pass it, so, in the preamble, under the existing regulatory inadequacies section, I wanted to give you a more particular example. I mentioned some of the connections between Oregon and legislation, didn't seem super clear to me. And I thought could be made more concrete, and that'd be useful. There was a conclusion that increased amenities in modern campgrounds leads to higher intensity. And I didn't think that was necessary. There was a conclusion that increased amenities in campgrounds, such as temporary structures or park bundles, led to more intensive use. Particularly in terms of boats, and I would like to see that more fully fleshed out, because a few things that occur to me are like, somebody in a tent is not necessarily less likely than someone who comes stay in a temporary structure to bring a boat. Why it was assumed that people in, it sounded like park model temporary structures would be more likely to turn over quickly. Because I would like to hear like the rationale for that.
Aren't they just-
Someone in an RV.
Saying that they were,
So. My point just being, there seem to be like some assumptions in there that at least were not clear to me, if they could be elucidated. And like. Another example, like people in RVs, tents, or a temporary structure all produce the same amount of sewage. They use the same amount of water to do it in different places. So why is the temporary structure a greater intensity of use? So I'd like to see a little more clarity around that. And again, I'm just gonna do this rapid fire. The renewal permit process, it seems like I'm curious, I guess, whether Chip and Jim have read the renewal permit process changes. And whether those raised any flags. They seemed somewhat substantive, but I wasn't actually sure in practice what effect that would have. Do either of you? Chip or Jim have comments on the changes to the renewal? No? Okay.
We need to look at it a little more closely just to see how it works, but I think you understand from the comment I made earlier about this having the dual purposes, and so we don't really want to confuse the annual inspection and renewal with the full-on permitting of this as a land use that would run the land. I want to make sure those two processes are distinct.
I guess that's what I'd like to make sure we're being clear about, because it's, I would think it inappropriate to ask for essentially an entirely new permit every year. That would be a significant burden on the town, on the CEO, and et cetera.
And
If that's not, it's,
It's required. That's
well,
no, I know a renewal is required.
but if the renewal is of the same rigor as the initial approval, then that's going to be a problem.
If
If
it's
it's
not,
renewal
that's-
as it is right now with the
Keep going.
just time.
that's all.
If that's a clarification, that's all that needs to happen, then great. In several places, I guess, Jim mentioned that I saw it in the deletion that references to mobile home parks were removed. And so I am wondering, will this require any additional ordinances concerning mobile home parks? Do you have thoughts on that? Or if you need a little bit more carefully.
We'll work through that. Just a note is that we don't have a mobile home park in town. We have the ordinance and regulations for it. And the new, thank you very much, manufactured housing regulations from the state, probably now those allow mobile homes anywhere.
Right.
So you're probably not gonna see another mobile home.
Yeah, there are two different things going on. In the name of affordable housing, the state has always wanted to allow mobile homes to be, or manufactured homes to be placed where the stick-built houses are, so that you don't discriminate against housing types. But the mobile home parks are there. Just a quick question. How many lots where are mobile home parks allowed in Wayne? And where are those located?
We don't have it.
We don't have any, but if I wanted to build one, where do they allow?
We don't have a limitation.
I have to go back.
Okay, but there is a spot that's
Right.
allowed, it may be a couple of lots, but
It's 3 zones.
okay, all right, thank you.
Under the lot size and density, another next quick point. Am I reading it correctly that there's a max 40-foot length for a dock? Or is it 40 feet per? Section 2C. The length of a pier or dock may not exceed 40 feet for every 250 feet of available shore frontage.
That's right out of the zoning. It's already in the zoning ordinance.
That's why I had to stop where I did.
Okay, so that's not changing existing behavior there around the dock length. Okay, great.
We may have reworded a few things, but it's already in the, it's already in the existing zoning ordinance stuff.
Okay,
Just one.
It was the 40 feet, but I-
put the same thing as in another ordinance, in this ordinance, there's a possibility one to be amended sometime and not the other. It's maybe better just to reference the other provision, but okay.
and I guess I had the same question there as to whether the number of boat slips allowed was a substantive change or simply a reference.
It's the same thing.
Great. And last point was some of the regulations, and again, this sort of speaks to like some perhaps better annotation as to what the cause was and what the effect was. Some of them, it was difficult for me to see what the purpose was, for example, and maybe these were sometimes it's hard with the track changes, maybe they're existing, but requiring the campground to submit a list of all stored vehicles to the CEO. It was not clear to me, I guess, what the purpose of that was. And I'm hesitant to just create more work for the town without a purpose to it, so
Those are the seasonals that are left there after the campground is closed, is that correct?
that's what it was.
Correct.
There was, yeah, so
Correct.
just,
And so the idea behind that was that those need to be disconnected for the winter months from any water, electricity, et cetera, as they're considered being stored by the campground. And we understand the importance to people being able to do that. Revenue for the campground as well as for the public.
Mhm.
That's a convenience to be able to leave them there, but to have a list in the event there is an emergency. If a fire happened over there was a break-in, how do you get a hold of X, Y, or Z to let them know? There should be a list of who owns the vehicle that is left there. In case, just in case,
okay,
you know?
We saw that requirement in many other ordinances.
That is, yes, and I think each campground probably might have their own specific ordinance about, they get their own rules about seasonals.
okay,
But I
Yeah.
think that's my thoughts. And I think all of us, it was common.
okay, yeah, that's great, yeah, and just an example where like annotation might be useful for some of these, because
In
looking at
case.
that, my first thought is like, are we supposed to go inspect them? Like, wait, who's gonna do that, and et cetera.
Well, I know a comment we had at our meeting was somebody wondered if that, like, for example, Chick might go over and check to make sure they are disconnected.
Yes, that's what my-
During the month, to make sure that they're all legal, hooked up, so forth, but, yeah, that was a public. comment.
Great.
No.
And I had similar questions, I guess, about regulations forbidding decks or screen rooms. Like, what is the?
You really need to talk louder and get a microphone.
A similar question regarding regarding forbidding decks or screen rooms.
Right, so.
We're gonna address that.
We are going to address that. We already have, a, for
I was
that,
taking note. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
and that will be addressed.
Okay. Great. I think the rest of what I have is I'll try to go through and delete what we've already talked about. I can send you and,
Put it on, just send it to me, we'll put it on the website.
okay, I
So
will,
everyone will have access.
everyone will have access.
Likewise, anything you have new, send it to me, we'll get it updated.
And again, being clear, these are simply my opinions. They do not need to be meant to necessarily pass the board. But I will send you what I have. You can read it.
I just had one question, Jim. During the process, you said that another 180-day extension could be asked for by the select board.
Right.
Only if there's been substantial work on a problem and the problem still exists.
Right,
So how do you determine if the problem still exists? Because by the way, I'm thinking that we defined the problem that existed by having the moratorium, that we felt that the ordinances that we have now didn't appropriately address the concerns that we have about campgrounds. And so that has not been solved.
Uh, You identified issues, but very broadly in that ordinance. And didn't say what sections of the ordinance in particular, or what issues in particular were causing inadequacy of the ordinance, or showed that public facilities weren't sufficient or overburdened. So I think just showing, Chip had talked about that earlier, describe just a little bit more.
right.
Particularly what the problems were. So the select board can take a look at that and say, yeah, you know, they identified these problems, these 15 issues or these 5 shortcomings. And we're working on it, they're working on it, everyone's making progress, we'll continue this. Just, it would help them to make those findings later.
Thank
We didn't make a motion to. If you want to, go ahead. You go to the proposal.
I'll defer to
we can take
Ed.
the motion.
I'll defer to Ed.
No. I make a motion that we adjourn this meeting. Second.
And we'll continue this discussion next. Discussion.
None?
We will continue the discussion next meeting. And I'll ask the committee, is the committee able to attend the next? Is the committee able to attend the next public hearing meeting?
The next meeting.
Sorry, the next public meeting,
19.
September 19th. You can, let us know if that presents a problem.